I like this slide because I like lists. I like being able to think through things, you know, and have the top 10 or something like that. So the dirty doesn't, asbestos isn't something we created. It's something it's a natural amount. But it's a problem because if you look at one of those fibers, they look like little microscopic needles. And if you look at it, literally, to me, it looked like a little needle. And the thing is, they're so small that when you breathe them in, it's like shooting an arrow into your lungs because they'll go in, when you breathe them in, they'll go right into your lungs. And what do? They stick right into the tissue of your lungs. They come in just like a little needle. And they stick in there, and you can't get them out. And what would a needle do when it's that small? It irritates your lungs, and your lungs start producing some liquid to try and dislodge it and get it out of there, you know? But it can't. And so it continually, so your lungs can fill up with liquid. So that's just, I'm not an asbestos expert. I'm not going to get into it anymore. I'm just saying, now you should be properly scared of asbestos after that. So, lead. I learned about lead a long time ago, and I was thinking, like, geez, when I was young, we had leaded gasoline. And wonder what that was like. And you know, the thing is, we learned that, you know, our bodies can take in lead, and then we can process it and we can expel it. You know, at a certain level, we can now. Kids or women that are pregnant, things like that, not acceptable. You know, but like me as an adult, I can take a little bit of lead and I can process it and I can get rid of a little bit of lead. Not every day, but if I get it occasionally. But here's my favorite, or my least favorite, mercury. Because remember, I was getting into water quality, right? That was going to be my thing, water quality. And I got into doing this stuff instead. But mercury, if you take just a little bit of mercury and you put it in your water supply, it'll contaminate the whole water supply. It's very dangerous, you know, if you get it in your system, and I think it bioaccumulates too, so that it doesn't leave, you know, so it gets worse the more you get. PCBs, you know, you'd say, well, where are PCBs? I know, they're in electrical transformers and things like that, right? That's not so bad. We know where those are, and we can make sure we take care of them. Except, it also can be in some treatment of wood. Well, that's a little bit harder. And we're here on the islands, and they're doing a lot of treatment of wood. So the question is, you know, is that an issue here? But the other thing is, it can be in caulking. And so you start getting into like, oh, they found out these PCBs were really helpful. They were really useful in these different things. And so then they started using them in different ways. And then only years later did they find out that they were really bad for you, you know. But ironically, the next thing on the list is pressure-treated wood. And that is really saying there's treated wood and pressure-treated wood. We won't get into the difference right now. But they use chemicals so that, you know, insects and that don't want to eat the wood because it poisons them. And but you know, the older pressure-treated wood can have some really bad chemicals in it. And that is why I think people don't want to see those reused. In the newer wood, it doesn't last as long as it's not as treated as heavily, I'm finding. But either way, it's definitely it's a definite concern. Like when our workers cut through, we try not to ever cut through treated wood, because then we're turning it into particles, right? We are the dust coming up from that. So we definitely try to wet things down when we cut through them, things like that, and we definitely try to wear a mask when we're cutting through treated wood. And frankly, we try to use gloves when we're handling it. You know, it's It's just not something worth doing. But hey, we already had gloves on. We were already wearing a mask anyway, so that's handy. Household chemicals, they're on the list here, and you'd say, well, that isn't part of the house, but it can be part of the project, you know? Like, and I can be talking about, I'm trying to think if it's on here. I don't see it anywhere else on the list, but I'm going to say pesticides. You know, I'm going to say you're trying to kill those termites, right? You have some insecticides or something for that, and well, they left a bunch of it behind. They left things underneath the kitchen sink. We talked about that earlier. You know, they're all things that you're not going to put those in the dumpster. You know, they should be held out and responsibly. I don't even want to call it disposed of. I'm going to responsibly turned over to the solid waste groups. Okay, so we've got some other materials there. Mold I'm going to focus on because you're in a wet and humid and hot environment. So like, and if you had a building that had roof damage from the hurricane, for example, then water gets in the building, but it can't get out of the building. That's when you get a real problem, you know. So we're really concerned about that. Petroleum products are on the list here. Well, we use some of those. We use some gas and we use some oil in our work, but there can be some left over from the house. In our area, we have heating oil and things like that. That they have tanks, and those tanks can leak, and that can be one of the worst contamination issues we deal with at some of these job sites, because these old tanks that would leak heating oil and they would spill out into the soil. So here's a real life thing, I mean, at almost every job, and that's sewage and septic materials. So especially if a building has been sitting vacant for a while, you never know, the water could be off, you don't have a way to deal with that. Silica, you know, every time I'm taking a chimney down, we're dealing with all the silica dust. A lot of, for years, like when I started, nobody was talking about silica like it was an issue. But you know, the last 10 years, I think is when I've been hearing where people are like really tied into that. And I don't need anybody to really tell me to wear a mask when I'm taking a chimney down because it's so dusty. It's just, and you know, it turns out that that dust is really bad for you. I thought it was bad because who knows what they did, who knows what they were burning in the chimney anyway. And so now you've got all these other chemicals and heavy metals that could be in the chimney itself, in that soot, you know. You guys even have chimneys here? Do you ever need? I was gonna say, like who has a chimney? It never gets cold here, so. Heating oil? You're like, what do you need? What is heating oil? It's never cold here. I mean, we don't heat. So then the drug labs, I mentioned that earlier, and we had an experience with that in Portland earlier this fall, where it was a drug lab, and we just walked away from the project. So I don't mean a marijuana grow up, because we had one of those too. And that wasn't, you know, I mean, we didn't see anything dangerous about that. But it was the chemicals and stuff that in the meth labs that are contaminating everything. They're in, you know, it permeated everything, it seemed like. That's what I've heard. So, okay, so here's an example. We went through the Dirty Dozen. Here's a real life example from St. John. Right? This is a building that it was damaged in the hurricanes, and some kind of corporation or something owns the property, and they wanted to do something with this property, and they weren't allowed to, and so now they're having a tantrum about it or something like that. So they left this mess since the hurricanes. They've done nothing to clean it up, you know. Now, what you can't see in the photo, either photo, and of course this one is in your book, can't see that that building is like 8 feet from the water. You know, the water, there's a little, behind the building, you can walk behind the building, but it's only about 8 feet from the wall of the building to the water, you know. And I don't know about tides, I don't know, but it certainly does, you know, I mean, I don't know about high tide versus low tide or anything like that, but it's that close. And materials, and we're talking how many years later? I don't know, when was the hurricane?
17.
17?
Yeah.
There's debris from this building in the water today. I mean, in August when I was here. And I'm like, what? You know, because the winds, you know, you look at this place. It's just a bunch of debris. And some of it had blown into the water 4 years later, and there's still debris blowing into the water. And they did nothing about it, you know, like nothing's been done. So, but this is you know, about an environmental hazard. Like, so look at this building. Let's say it's an older building. Let's say it's from like 1960. It could have asbestos in it. It could have lead in it, right? It most certainly has mold in it because it doesn't have a roof on it anymore. You know, and it's got like an inch of water in the basement, and it's got debris everywhere, broken glass everywhere. It's got debris, it's blowing into the water, that's bad. Like all of those safety issues I talked about are a lot of them are here. And so now you've got a real problem because now if there was asbestos in there, and now it could have been disturbed, so it could be contaminating what's left. On the flip side, there were still doors and windows that were perfectly intact. There was a whole wood floor. There was a cistern that looked reusable. I have a feeling somebody might want that. And you say, well, how are we getting out of the building? Well, there isn't much building left to remove around it, and should be able to lift it right out of there. So, but you know, that's a real life site, and I get it. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be done. So, okay. So we talked about lead and asbestos, and now here's another one. I think these are also St. John. There's a church, and this is in your book, which I have the page numbers. But I've got two pictures there. One I think is a school. The blue one I think is a school. And then the church is also on, you know, I think they're both on St. John now. The big deal about the blue building is it doesn't have a roof. So what happened to the roof? Is it inside the building? You know, which could be just a big giant pile of nailed boards and debris. That's a hazard. But right now we're really talking about environmental hazards, and this, what I'm trying to bring up is the church, really. It's like the church has most of its roof left. You see how they tried to tarp it and everything? What they may have done is locked in all the moisture. Like the moisture got in there, and the moisture is still getting in there because they tried to do the roof, but you see that it doesn't all have a tarp on it. You know, so there's probably moisture getting into the building, but it can't get out of the building. So what does that do? It's going to create more